They had given her tea before telling her she was mad, which Cordelia thought showed a certain low cunning on the part of the Ashwood family solicitor, since it is difficult to weep convincingly with a cup and saucer balanced on one's knee. The morning room at Gallowmere Hall was full of October light, thin and silver off the sea, and it fell across the Turkey carpet and the black bombazine of her morning gown and the three grave faces arranged opposite her like a jury that had already reached its verdict before the trial began. Mr. Pennywhistle cleared his throat. Her brother-in-law did not look at her at all, which told her everything she needed to know. The way the housekeeper's two hands on a trunk had once told a different sort of story to a different sort of woman, though Cordelia did not know that story and would not for some months yet. "Lady Ashwood," said Mr. Pennywhistle, in the voice of a man reading a sentence he had composed with some pride the night before, "you must understand that no one wishes to distress you further in your grief." "How kind," said Cordelia. "And yet here we all are, distressing me, with the tea going cold as evidence of your restraint." Julian Ashwood, who had been the Honourable Mr. Ashwood a fortnight ago and was the Viscount Ashwood now, in his dead brother's chair, with his dead brother's signet ring already loose and gleaming on his finger, made a small pained sound, as a man makes when a joke lands somewhere he had specifically asked it not to. "This is precisely the difficulty, Cordelia. You cannot help yourself. Reginald is not a fortnight in the ground and you make sport at his own hearth." "I make sport because the alternative is screaming, Julian, and I am told screaming is unbecoming in a widow, however richly it may be deserved." She set down the cup, because her hand had begun very slightly to shake, and she would not give them the satisfaction of watching it. "I have told you what I saw. I have told the magistrate what I saw. A man on the cliff path above Gallowmere Cove, in a storm that no sane person would have chosen for a midnight ride, standing where no path runs and no reason exists to stand, not 30 yards from where my husband's horse came down. I did not imagine him. I did not dream him. I saw him with my own eyes from my own window, and I will go on saying so however many teas you pour at me." "You saw," said Mr. Pennywhistle in the gentle, unbearable tone reserved for the very young and the very ill, "a shadow, my lady, in a storm at a distance you have yourself described as considerable, through glass streaming with rain, at an hour when grief and sleeplessness had already, by your own admission, disordered your rest for some nights previous. I do not say you lie. I say only that the human eye is a poor witness in such conditions, and that a coroner's jury of 12 sensible men found his lordship's death misadventure, plainly and without dissent, and that a widow who insists otherwise publicly, repeatedly, to constables and clergymen and now to me, does her own credit no good service." "My credit," Cordelia said, "was never the one in question, sir. I begin to wonder whose is." It was the wrong thing to say or the right one, depending on which side of the room one happened to be sitting. She watched it land on Julian's face like a struck match, watched him go still in the particular way of a man who has been touched nearer the truth than he cares to admit even to himself. He recovered smoothly. He had always recovered smoothly. It was, she was coming to understand, the family talent, more reliably inherited than the Ashwood chin or the Ashwood debts. "There is a house," he said, "at Penrose on the Devon coast. Restful. Well regarded. Dr. Crane has had considerable success there with ladies of a nervous constitution, and I am assured the sea air alone works wonders. It is not," he added before she could speak, "an asylum, whatever unkind word you are already forming. It is a retreat. A place to rest and grieve properly, and be looked after by people who understand these things better than a solitary widow rattling about a great house full of her husband's ghost. And if I decline this generous invitation to be looked after, then Pennywhistle informs me the matter may go before the Lord Chancellor's Commission, who will appoint an independent person to determine the soundness of your mind, since as Reginald's widow you retain certain claims upon the estate that cannot, in fairness to all parties, be left in the keeping of a lady whose judgment is publicly in question. I do not wish it to come to that, Cordelia. I am trying," he said, and here, wonder of wonders, his voice did shake, whether from guilt or grief or simple exhaustion at his own performance she could not yet tell, "to spare you the worse indignity." Cordelia looked at the tea going cold and at the ring on his finger and at the grey sea beyond the window, the same sea that had taken her husband down onto the rocks 11 days before, and understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, the way the eye of a storm is peaceful, that she was entirely alone in the world, that no one in this room believed her, that no one in the county believed her, and that belief, apparently, was a thing that could be bought and arranged and delivered to a lady's door like a milliner's box by anyone with the coin and the patience to order it. "Send for your commission then," she said. "I find I am no longer afraid of being disbelieved. I have had 11 days of practice. The independent person, when he arrived 9 days later in a plain black chaise with no crest upon the door, was not at all what she had pictured. She admitted to herself, a small dry man with spectacles and a ledger, the sort of man who measured sanity with a ruler. What came up the drive instead, dismounting before the chaise had properly stopped, was a tall broad-shouldered man of perhaps 35 with the weathered, unfashionable brown of a man who spent more time on horseback than in drawing-rooms, dark hair cropped close against the sea wind, and a face that had been handsome once in an easy way and had since been rebuilt, stone by stone, into something more guarded. He wore no gloves. He carried his own case up the steps rather than wait for a footman, which struck her, before anything else about him did, as the action of a man impatient with unnecessary ceremony, or else a man who did not entirely trust servants he had not chosen himself. Mrs. Trevelyan, the housekeeper, a broad grey woman with a face like a closed door that had nonetheless never quite shut against Cordelia, announced him with the flat reluctance of a woman delivering bad news she has not yet decided how bad it is. "The Earl of Rothmere, my lady, come from the Lord Chancellor's office." "An earl," said Cordelia, rising. "How reassuring. I had feared they would send a clerk, and clerks so rarely have the imagination to believe anything at all." Lord Rothmere's grey eyes moved over her in one long unhurried pass, the morning black, the too pale face, the steadiness of her hands, which she had schooled, this time, into stillness before he ever crossed the threshold. It was not an insolent look. It was an assessing one, and she had the sudden uncomfortable sense of being read like a page of accounts. "I have no imagination whatever, Lady Ashwood," he said. "I have found it a considerable inconvenience in my profession, and a considerable advantage in this one. I am not sent to believe you or disbelieve you. I am sent to observe you for a fortnight in your own house, going about your own business, and to report to the commission whether I find in you the ordinary grief of a widow or something requiring gentler handling. I will tell you plainly that Mr. Ashwood's solicitor has already called upon me twice this week to describe you as unwell, and that his eagerness on the point has told me a good deal more about Mr. Ashwood than about you." Something in Cordelia's chest, drawn tight for 11 days and then 9 more, loosened by the smallest fraction. She was careful not to let it show. "You will forgive me, my lord, if I do not yet trust the eagerness of anyone under this roof, including my own." "I would think considerably less of you if you did," said the Earl of Rothmere, and set down his case, and looked about the morning room with the frank curiosity of a man cataloguing a battlefield. "Shall we begin? Tell me what you told the coroner, and then tell me what you did not, because I have read his transcript twice on the road down and I do not believe for one moment that 12 sensible men heard the whole of it. He was, she came to learn over the following days, a man who asked questions the way other men ate, methodically, without haste, returning always for a second helping of anything that had not been fully explained the first time. He walked the cliff path with her on the second morning, in a wind that whipped her mourning veil out flat behind her like a black flag, and made her stand at her own bedroom window and point to the exact place on the headland where she had seen the figure, and then walked out to that exact place himself and stood in it for the better part of an hour while she watched from the glass, testing, she understood, whether a man could in fact be seen from that window in that light, whether the thing she claimed to have witnessed was in the realm of the possible or only the realm of grief's invention. "Well," she said when he came back in, wet to the knee and entirely unbothered by it, "am I mad, my lord?" "You are extremely visible from that window," said Lord Rothmere, accepting the towel Mrs. Trevelyan offered him with the absent gratitude of a man used to being looked after by women who did not entirely approve of him. "I stood exactly where you indicated for the better part of an hour in conditions considerably milder than the night in question, and I promise you I was as plain as a lighthouse. Whoever stood there on the night your husband died wished to be there and not on the path proper, which is a strange place for an innocent man to choose to walk in a storm, and a very good place indeed for a man watching to see whether his work had been done." Cordelia sat down rather suddenly on the window seat. "You believe me. I believe your eyes, which is not quite the same thing as believing your theory, and I would thank you not to conflate the two prematurely, as I intend to be considerably more careful than that." But he said it gently, for a man who had arrived 9 days ago with no imagination whatever, and Cordelia found, to her own considerable irritation, that she wanted to weep and did not, because 11 days and then 9 more had taught her that tears in this house were currency spent for other people's purposes, and she had grown miserly with hers. "Why," she asked instead, "does it matter to you at all? You are sent to assess my mind, my lord, not to solve my husband's death." Lord Rothmere was quiet a moment, toweling the rain from his dark hair with more force than the task strictly required. "Because I buried a wife myself 4 years ago in circumstances the coroner also called misadventure, and because there were 3 days in the aftermath when I very nearly believed the world's version of events over my own certain knowledge, simply because the world said it with more confidence than I could summon for the truth. I did not have a fortnight of a stranger's scrutiny to save me from that mistake. I had only my own stubbornness, which very nearly was not enough." He set the towel aside. "I find I have no patience left for watching it happen twice." It was the first thing he had told her that was not, in some fashion, a question, and Cordelia understood it for the gift it was, and did not press him further, though she carried the shape of it with her for the rest of that long gray afternoon, the way one carries a stone smooth enough to be pleasant in the pocket. The trouble, of course, was that belief without proof purchased her nothing at all with the commission, and Julian Ashwood had not spent 9 days idle while the Earl walked her cliffs. On the 5th morning a groom arrived from Ashwood's own stables to swear, weeping with apparent sincerity, that her ladyship had confided to him, the week before his lordship's death, a wish that she were free of her marriage, and that he had held his tongue out of loyalty until his conscience would permit it no longer. Cordelia had never in her life exchanged more than good morning with the boy in question, a fact she stated flatly and which the boy, under Lord Rothmere's patient and increasingly precise questioning, could not make survive contact with a single specific detail, not the day, not the hour, not where in the stableyard such a remarkable confidence was supposed to have been offered, until at last he broke and admitted, white and shaking, that Mr. Ashwood's man of business had given him 2 guineas and the words to say them in. 2 guineas, Lord Rothmere said afterward in the library, turning the number over as though it were a coin he might yet spend himself. "A man does not part with 2 guineas to invent a small lie, Lady Ashwood. He parts with 2 guineas because a large lie is what stands between him and something he wants very much indeed." "The dower properties," Cordelia said slowly. "The Trevanion mine leases came to me under the settlement, not to the title. Reginald changed it 3 years ago, over Julian's very loud objections, because Julian had run the Trevanion workings near to ruin the once he was given charge of them, and Reginald did not trust him with a second chance. If I am declared unfit, the leases revert to the estate under the guardianship provisions, and Julian holds the title, and Julian therefore holds everything. Then we no longer have merely a suspicious shadow on a cliff path," said Lord Rothmere, and something had come alight behind the grey of his eyes that she had not seen there before, the look, she thought, of a man who has finally been handed the shape of the thing he has been hunting blind. "We have a motive with a figure attached to it, and a motive is a very great deal more than I arrived here with 9 days ago. It was Mrs. Trevelyan who gave them the rest of it on the 9th night, in the manner of a woman who has been keeping a stone in her shoe for a very long while and has at last found someone she trusts enough to remove her boot in front of. She came to Cordelia's chamber past midnight with a single candle and her grey hair loose beneath her cap, and stood twisting her apron exactly as another housekeeper in another house might one day twist hers over another door that had been shut too long, though Cordelia did not know that either, and would not for some months yet. There's a strong box, my lady, in the old steward's room off the counting-house, that Mr. Julian had moved down from the London house not 3 weeks before his lordship died, and had the locksmith to fit new bolts on the door, and told no one why, and I have thought of it every night since and said nothing because I did not know what I was accusing a man of, and a housekeeper does not accuse a viscount without knowing." Her hands stopped their twisting. "But I know what a guilty man's face looks like, my lady. I have 30 years of faces in this house to measure his against, and I have never once seen a face so guilty as his was, the morning they carried your husband up from the rocks. Grief does not look like that. I have seen grief. That was not grief. That was a man watching to see if he had got away with it." Lord Rothmere was in the library still. The fire burned low, ledgers of Trevanion mine returns spread across the desk where he had been comparing them, line by line, against the estate accounts for 3 days running, hunting the arithmetic of a motive the way another man might hunt a fox, patiently, and without any illusion that the creature would come easily to ground. He listened to Mrs. Trevelyan's account without once interrupting, and when she had finished he was very still for a moment, the particular stillness Cordelia had learned to recognize as the sound of a great many small facts falling suddenly into a single large and terrible shape. "A locked box, fitted new 3 weeks before a death arranged to look like an accident," he said. "I have sat on the bench long enough, Lady Ashwood, to know that guilty men are, without exception, the worst organized criminals in England, because guilt makes a man secretive in exactly the places that draw the eye. He has hidden his proof rather than destroyed it, because some sliver of him could not quite bear to burn it, and that sliver is going to hang him." He rose and reached for his coat. "Mrs. Trevelyan, where is that room, and does your master keep the only key, or has 30 years of housekeeping left you with a spare he does not know about?" The old woman's chin came up, ducal and absolute, and for the first time since his arrival she looked, Cordelia thought, almost pleased. "I have kept a spare to every lock in this house since before Mr. Julian was breached, my lord. A housekeeper who does not is not worth her keep." The strong box, when it gave up its bolts a little after 1 in the morning by the light of 2 shielded lamps, held nothing so dramatic as a confession, which would have been, Lord Rothmere observed drily, a great deal more than any competent villain ever left lying about for the convenience of his pursuers. It held instead the far duller and far more damning matter of debt, a stack of gaming vouchers from 3 London clubs bearing Julian Ashwood's signature and totaling a sum that made Cordelia's breath catch, and beneath them a letter in a moneylender's cramped hand giving him 3 months, no more, to satisfy an obligation secured, the letter noted with brutal commercial precision, against expectations he did not yet legally possess, and beneath that, folded small and worn soft at the creases, as though it had been read and reread and carried close, a single sheet in Julian's own hand, unfinished, unsent, addressed to no one, in which a man who could not quite bring himself to write the plain word had circled it from every possible angle instead. If R were no longer to stand between the mine leases and their true purpose, if the settlement could be shown void, if C could be made to seem unfit before the thing is questioned at all, and at the bottom, blotted as though the pen had been set down hard and picked up trembling, 3 words that needed no lawyer's gloss to interpret: "The path tonight." Lord Rothmere read it through twice by lamplight, his jaw tight, and then set it down upon the strong box lid with the exaggerated care of a man handling something that might yet go off in his hands. "It is not a confession," he said quietly. "A clever man of business could argue for a fortnight over what it does and does not prove. But it is enough, Lady Ashwood, together with a groom's 2 guineas and a strong box fitted new 3 weeks before your husband died and a debt 3 months from ruin, to lay before the commission in place of your character, which is precisely the exchange your brother-in-law never imagined anyone would think to make. He built his whole scheme upon the assumption that no one would look past the widow to the debtor. It was, I confess, very nearly a good plan. It failed only because he underestimated a housekeeper's spare key and a lady's stubborn refusal to be talked out of what her own 2 eyes had shown her." "You said you had no imagination, my lord?" "I have none whatever." The ghost of something that was very nearly a smile crossed his tired face, the first she had seen there since his arrival, and it altered him considerably, the way sun through cloud alters a grey coastline without changing a single stone of it. "I have only stubbornness and a great deal of arithmetic, and I find between the 2 of them a man may go a very long way toward the truth, provided he has the patience not to stop halfway out of comfort." The commission convened at Gallowmere Hall itself 8 days later, at Julian Ashwood's own insistence, since he had been confident, fatally confident as it transpired, that a hearing held under his own roof, before a panel he had spent considerable effort cultivating over the preceding fortnight, would end precisely as he intended. He had not reckoned on an earl who arrived not merely with an opinion of the widow's sanity but with a strong box's worth of arithmetic laid out upon the very desk where the panel sat, nor on a magistrate from the county assizes summoned quietly the night before at Lord Rothmere's own request, nor, above all, on the particular expression that crossed his face when Mrs. Trevelyan was called to describe a spare key kept 30 years against a day she could not have named, and he understood, in the space of that single sentence, precisely how thoroughly his own house had turned against him. He tried, to his credit or his ruin, one final throw of the dice. "This is theatre," he said, rising, his voice pitched to carry to every corner of the room, the same performance he had given her in the morning room a month before, though it fit him considerably less well the second time. A grieving widow's fancy, dressed up now with forged papers and a housekeeper's spite, because his lordship here has taken it into his head to play the knight-errant for a pretty face in black. I ask this commission to consider which is the more probable tale, that a viscount murdered his own brother over a mine lease, or that a woman unbalanced by grief has found a sympathetic ear willing to indulge her. "I would consider it very probable indeed," said Lord Rothmere, without raising his voice at all, which somehow carried a great deal further than Julian's had I not spent the last fortnight testing every particular of Lady Ashwood's account against the plain evidence of eyes, ears, and arithmetic, and found it, at every point, to hold. I did not come to this house prepared to believe her, Mr. Ashwood. I came prepared to certify her unfit if the evidence supported it, and I would have done so without a moment's hesitation, whatever face she wore while I did it, because I have buried a wife on the strength of a coroner's misadventure once already, and I have no taste left for repeating another family's tragedy out of misplaced gallantry. I certify instead that Lady Ashwood is, and has throughout been, entirely sound of mind, and that the true unsoundness in this matter lies in a strong-box fitted new 3 weeks before a death, which this commission is welcome to examine at its leisure. He turned to the magistrate at his elbow. I believe, sir, the rest is now properly your office and not mine. They took Julian Ashwood out through his own front hall within the hour, past the portrait of his brother that hung still and watchful above the stair, and Cordelia, standing at the morning-room window with her hand at last permitted to shake as freely as it liked, watched the constable's carriage carry him away down the long grey avenue between the wind-bent trees, and felt not triumph, quite, but something quieter and more durable settle into the place where 11 days and then a fortnight more of disbelief had worn a raw patch in her. You will stay another day at least, she said to Lord Rothmere that evening, when the last of the commission's carriages had rattled off into the dark and the house had gone, for the first time in a month, entirely quiet in a way that did not feel like a held breath. Mrs. Trevelyan has already informed me she will consider it a personal affront if you leave before you have eaten a proper dinner in this house, since you have spent a fortnight subsisting on tea and other people's arithmetic. I would not dream of affronting Mrs. Trevelyan, said the Earl gravely. I have met men on the bench with gentler tempers and considerably less authority. He stood at the library window beside her, the fire behind them throwing their 2 shadows long across the same Turkey carpet where, a month before, a solicitor had poured her tea before telling her she was mad. I ought to tell you, Lady Ashwood, that my commission here concluded the moment the magistrate took Mr. Ashwood into custody. I have no further professional reason to remain under this roof even one night longer, and a great many reasons of propriety to remove myself to the inn at Gallowmere village before the county begins to talk. How disappointing, said Cordelia. I had hoped your imagination might have improved in the interval. It has improved a very great deal as it happens, and almost entirely on your account, which is precisely why propriety recommends the inn. He turned from the window, and the fire found the gray of his eyes and warmed them to something nearer silver. I told you once that I had buried a wife and very nearly let the world talk me out of my own certain knowledge in the aftermath. I did not tell you that I resolved in the 4 years since never again to trust my own judgment where a lady's welfare was concerned, precisely because I had once trusted it so badly that I lost 3 days to doubt when she needed me steady. I came to this house prepared to be nothing to you but a fair and disinterested arbiter, Lady Ashwood, and I have failed at the disinterested part so thoroughly and so early that I no longer trust myself to report it honestly to my own conscience. Cordelia's heart, which had survived a husband's death and a brother-in-law's betrayal and a fortnight of being weighed like a parcel of disputed goods, did something entirely undignified and entirely without her leave. You are informing me, my lord, in the most roundabout fashion I have yet encountered from a man who claims to have no imagination whatever, that you have formed an attachment. I am informing you, said the Earl of Rothmere, that I stood in a rainstorm on your headland for the better part of an hour testing whether a shadow could be seen from your window, and that somewhere in that hour I stopped thinking about the coroner's transcript entirely and began thinking instead that I had never in 4 years met a woman who insisted so fiercely on the truth of her own eyes against the comfortable weight of everyone else's opinion, and that I found I did not want to leave this house without telling her so, whatever propriety recommends about the inn at Gallowmere village. That, said Cordelia, is not a proposal, my lord. I am given to understand those generally involve a question. I have grown cautious about questions where you are concerned, Lady Ashwood. The last man who put a great many confident questions to you in this room did so over cold tea, in order to tell you what to believe about your own mind. I find I would rather simply say the true thing and let you do with it as you please, since you have never yet needed a man's permission to know your own judgment, and I have no wish to be the first to offer it as though it were mine to give. He held out his hand, not toward her, but palm up, in the space between them, the way a man offers a thing rather than takes one. I love you. It is considerably too soon, and I have known you a bare month, most of it spent testing the honesty of your grief for a chancery commission, which is not, by any account I have ever heard, the customary road into a woman's affections. But I find I have grown tired of the customary road, and I would rather stand here and tell you the truth plainly than ride to the inn tonight and lie awake composing a more decorous version of it for tomorrow. Cordelia looked at the offered hand and at the fire, and at the portrait of Reginald that hung in the hall beyond the door, kind and ordinary and gone, and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she was smiling, the first unguarded smile the house had seen from her in a month. I have spent 5 weeks, she said, being told my own eyes lied to me. I find I have grown rather fond of a man who took the trouble to stand in the rain and test whether they did. She put her hand in his. Stay for dinner, my lord. Mrs. Trevelyan will never forgive either of us if you do not, and I begin to think her good opinion matters a great deal more to the smooth running of this house than either of ours. He did not, in the end, remove to the inn at Gallowmere village that night, propriety and Mrs. Trevelyan's dinner both being, on reflection, considerably more flexible than either had first appeared, though the county would go on talking regardless, as counties do, and Cordelia found she no longer minded in the slightest what was said of her at other people's tables, having already survived the worst that talk could do. The Trevelyan leases, restored to her outright once the Commission's findings were formally entered, funded within the year a new sea wall below the cliff path and a school in the village and, at Lord Rothmere's quiet insistence, a modest pension for the groom who had taken 2 guineas and a set of borrowed words and had, in the fullness of the hearing, been the first to break and tell the truth of where they came from, which the Earl maintained ought to count for something even in a young man, who had very nearly done a great wrong for want of the courage to refuse it. They were married the following autumn in the small stone church above Gallowmere Cove, with the sea running silver below the headland and the same wind that had once carried a shadow across a rain-streaked window now merely stirring the hem of a wedding gown, and Mrs. Trevelyan wept without shame through the whole of the register signing and blamed it, with great violence, on the sea air, exactly as she had blamed it once before on the hay, though there was no hay anywhere within a mile of that particular chapel, and everyone present was kind enough not to remark on it. You never did finish telling me, Cordelia said to her husband some months later, walking the cliff path in the last warm light of a September evening with the new sea wall gleaming pale below them and the gulls wheeling white against a sky gone the color of a well-kept ledger, why a magistrate with no imagination whatever chose, of every widow in England he might have been sent to assess, to fall in love with the single most difficult one on the books. I have turned that question over a great many times myself, said the Earl of Rothmere, and I find I always arrive at the same dull answer. I spent 4 years believing that a woman's certain knowledge of her own life was a fragile thing, easily talked out of her by grief or convention or a solicitor with a well-poured cup of tea, and I built a great deal of caution on that belief and called it wisdom. And then I met a lady who had been told by every person meant to love and protect her that her own eyes had lied to her, and who declined, at considerable personal cost, to agree with them. He took her hand, ringless no longer, though the ring fit her properly now, a jeweler in Truro having seen to that within a week of the wedding. I find a man who has spent 4 years believing women's certainties are fragile things learns a great deal, rather quickly, from a woman who proves they are not fragile at all. They are only, on occasion, unfashionable to hold. I have grown considerably fonder of the unfashionable position than I ever expected to be, my lady. I recommend it highly. Below them the fountain of New-turned sea broke white against the restored wall, and the swifts that nested each summer in the church tower cut low across the darkening water, and the lady everyone refused to believe walked on beside the one man who finally had, with the whole of the long gold evening opening out ahead of them like a road neither one of them had any further need to doubt.